Hello everyone, welcome back to Carlton Carnivores, and I have a special friend for you guys today. We're starting up the pet series again a little bit. I've shown on this channel before some of the bigger animals that I care for. Callie, the reticulated python, Rebel, the bull snake, but I also work with a lot of little guys as well, and little guys are often much better pets on average for your average pet keeper. And what I have today is actually kind of the opposite end of the scale from Callie. This is another python, but one that will never get anywhere near the size of a retic. This right here, this is Namer. He is a spotted python, Antaresia maculosa. The genus Antaresia is the smallest genus of pythons. The spotted pythons here are actually the biggest of the species in the genus, and even they don't really get all that big, but we'll get to that in a minute. So these are an Australian python species, much like my carpet python bindi, or Australian and Papua New Guinea native. So these guys are found from kind of the coast along, don't go in my sleeve. They're found along the northeast coast of Australia, from kind of northern New South Wales. They just barely make it into that state, up along the coast of Queensland, and then they are just found on the southern edge of Papua New Guinea. So they're kind of a coastal, cool, rainforest, rocky dwelling animal. They are actually somewhat habitat generalists, a terrestrial ground-dwelling python, but generalists, so they'll be found in grasslands, in forests, in sometimes developed areas as well, but they especially like living in habitats that are rocky, that have crevices or even caves in them. That's where they are happiest. And their relatives, the other species of pygmy pythons, as they're often called, are found further west along in Northern Territory, over down into Western Australia and Perth. So over there you get the children's python, which includes the former species Stimson's python, and then the actual smallest python in the world, the pygmy pythons from Perth. Again, these are the largest of the dwarf pythons, and they are also the oldest in the genus. So these guys are estimated to have diverged from their relatives over 27 million years ago. So they've been following their own evolutionary path for that long. And they will grow on average to about 3.5 feet, usually, is adult size. The spotted pythons will get up to 4.5 feet, and the record length, which surprisingly came from a male, which males are often smaller than females in most pythons, and these guys often included, but the record length was from a male that was 69 inches long, so almost 6 feet. So these get quite a bit bigger than their relatives, which stay usually under 3 feet in length. But even then, still overall, a relatively small python. Because again, your average adult is only between 3 and 4 feet long. Namer here, if we stretch him out just a little bit, he's probably somewhere around 3.5 feet in length altogether. And he's not going to grow too much beyond this. Like, he'll continue growing for his entire life, of course, but he's going to do that very, very slowly from this point out, because he's already a few years old at this point. So they're a pretty small, pretty compact animal, really good for someone who doesn't have a whole lot of space to keep a much bigger snake. And you can see they have a lot of the pattern that you would be familiar with from bigger pythons, that dark, spotty look. So in some ways, I almost think he looks like a miniature anaconda with his coloration. But so these guys in the wild, they are prey generalists usually. They will take, especially when they're young, lizards of various kinds. You're okay. And they will, as they grow up, switch over to rodents of various types, occasionally small birds, especially ground-dwelling birds, because again, these guys aren't really climbers too much, although they will occasionally get up into trees and rock faces and such. But where they live in caves, they actually really enjoy going after bats. So they'll get up kind of on shallow rock ledges and such and wait until nightfall, and then as the bats fly out of the cave mouth, or as the bats are returning during the morning, they will nab the bats out of the sky. This is actually a behavior that's seen in a number of species worldwide. You'll find it in like the Caribbean boas will do that in caves on the Caribbean islands. You have reticulated pythons in Indonesia will do this in caves, especially the smaller ones. You also have in Central America and Mexico, you have various species of rat snake and rat snake relatives that also are very well known for hunting bats in their habitat. Now, again, these guys are relatively small, which makes them really good pets on average, at least when it comes to size and space for keeping them. It's important to note, you'll notice I am wearing gloves because this species especially, I would say, is a great example of animals are individuals. They all have different personalities. Oftentimes you will find a lot of spotted pythons that are fairly docile animals, especially once they grow up. They like to just kind of hang out, poke around, check on things, like Namera is doing here. He's checking out the plants. But you also have some that will be really snappy, bitey animals, and a few that, like these guys, are not exactly the brightest of the bunch. So they're relatively docile animals. Once you get them out of the cage, they like to just kind of explore and run around. But they have a hard time figuring out that the smell of me, my hands especially, is not the same thing as the smell of mouse. So they like to try and chew on my hands. So I wear gloves just to avoid that headache. It doesn't do a whole lot because, again, you can see this is a tiny little snake, especially that little tiny head. There's not a whole lot that they can do when they actually bite. Like the teeth, yeah, you might get a couple of pinpricks and draw some blood, but there's no worry about actually getting an injury from a bite from a spotted python. A couple of pinpricks and that's it. Wash with soap and water and you're good. But if you find a snake that is a docile individual, very calm, laid back, and a little smarter than my two are, Namera is better than the female Seraphina. She thinks everything is food and does not care. But if you find one that is relatively calm, or if you're a person who's willing to work with a snake that might take a little nip at you every now and again, they're pretty easy to set up as pets. So again, since they only grow to like 3 to 4 feet long, the cage size you need as a minimum, let's say bare minimum, because bigger is frequently better if you know how to set it up right. Minimum cage size is 30 inches to 3 feet in one direction and a foot or two other dimensions. So like 3 feet by 1.5 by maybe 1 to 2 feet high, especially if you put any sort of furnishings in there like logs and branches for them to climb on when they do decide to get up and climb around a little bit. What are you doing? He's seeing my hand moving around, so he's going into defensive mode a little bit here, so we'll let him just calm down. But if you give them a little height, they will use it on occasion. Again, they will get up onto like rock ledges and such to hunt bats. But a relatively small cage as far as it goes for reptiles. And when you set up, you don't need a whole lot of deep substrate since they're not really burrowers. So just a couple of inches of whatever substrate you use. It's best to use something that's relatively good for moderate moisture, because these guys need an average of about maybe 40 to 55% humidity to do best. They do come from relatively humid areas in the wild, but again, they're habitat generalists, so they can tolerate a lot of variation in conditions that you might give them. So if you put a relatively dry substrate down, they're good with that. If you have something that'll hold a little bit moisture, as long as it's an aerated tank, that's also pretty good for them. Give them several hides, because again, these are very nocturnal animals. If you look close, of course, you can see they have elliptical pupils like most pythons do. That signals they come out at night for most of their activity. You will see them out in the day. I frequently see this guy Namer actually wandering around during the day in his enclosure. But several hides that they can choose from to hide in, and the hide again should be about the size where the snake can curl up comfortably inside, touching all the sides of the enclosure or the hide, and then several of those around with logs and branches in between to just kind of clutter up the space, give them a feeling of security, things to climb in, things to explore. And then temperature-wise, they're also pretty easy to keep because they don't need it extremely hot like some other species might. A basking zone of between 80 to 85 degrees, maybe a little warmer, depending on your specific conditions, is great for them. And then the cool side can be down as low as 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit because though these guys come from Australia and come from northern Australia, a lot of that habitat is actually relatively cool rainforest. So they live in habitats where it's not actually stifling hot most of the time. It's cool, it's shady, so they have moderate basking temperature requirements that are actually best for them. And then feeding, of course, is pretty easy because most of these guys, they take rodents naturally in the wild, so they'll eat your frozen thawed mice usually with fair ease. One reason you might not see them in captivity quite so commonly is because these guys, along with their relatives, the other pygmy pythons, as babies they often feed almost exclusively on small lizards, and in some cases they hatch out so small that it's hard for them to be able to actually get down even a newborn pinky mouse. So babies sometimes really like going after lizards, and it takes a little time sometimes if they start off that way to wean them onto mice and other rodents that people are more commonly able to get a hold of. But once they're past that point, they're usually ready feeders on rodents, small birds, so if you get quail or chickens, those will often work very well as well. And your average feeding schedule for these guys, they have a slightly higher metabolism than some other pythons might, but they are still pythons, so relatively slow metabolisms. They're a relatively slow-moving ambush predators, so they don't need to eat a lot. Young ones, when you're raising them up, of course, should be fed once a week on average. And then when they get to adult size, like this guy, when they start leveling off on their growth rates, feeding them once every other week, even depending on the size of the meal, once every 3 to 4 weeks is just fine, and you will see them retain their weight. You can see this guy is relatively round, and he's got kind of a bread loaf shape, so he's got rounded sides, but you can see kind of a dimple where the musculature is formed all over the top of his back. If you start to see him if you have a snake that starts kind of bulging a little bit at the sides, that's a sign that they're starting to get a little overweight, and that's not good, and you want to pull back on feeding. Again, because every animal is an individual, you have to kind of judge based on your animal how often you should be feeding. Yeah, you're okay. He's gotten into his exploration mode again. But once you figure out what your animal needs, more likely than not, you'll be feeding somewhere between once every 2 to 3 weeks for an adult python like this. And the size of mouse usually, and this is a good reference for most species of snake, is about the same width as the widest part of the body, maybe up to 1.5 times the width of that part of the body is best for them. So a snake like this is taking medium to large mice every couple of weeks. If you have a snake that starts looking a little thick on a rate like that, then you just pull back for a couple weeks. And erratic feeding often is pretty good for these guys as well. Now, I don't personally have experience yet with getting these guys to breed. I have not succeeded with doing that. But general references suggest that they are fairly easy to breed if that's something that you want to try out. These are snakes that they're relatively tropical, but they do experience mild seasons. So during winter, they often go off of feed and temperatures cool down in their natural habitat a little bit. So reflecting that in your conditions will help kind of stimulate a breeding cycle. So during winter for 3 or 4 months, dropping the temperatures from a basking zone of 80 to 85 degrees down to maybe 75, 78 degrees with a cool zone in the low to mid 60s will trigger them to start going into that mating cycle. With males, that means they'll start getting a lot more explorative. This guy's been showing that a little bit, although he hasn't really shown any interest in the female. And then, of course, females will start ovulating. As soon as temperatures start warming up again, once you kick that back up in spring, that's when they usually actually go into mating. And males will seek out females. You put them together. It's always best to watch them when you do so to make sure that they're actually compatible, that they're tolerating each other. But males will follow the females. They will court them and then mate. That process usually lasts a couple of hours. And then they'll go on their own separate ways. The female will take 6 to 8 weeks to develop eggs and lay those, and then depending on how much of a challenge you want, you can either take those eggs out and set them up in an incubator around 85 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and they'll hatch out in usually 55 to 65 days. Or, just like most pythons, these are brooding animals. So females will coil around the eggs and actually incubate them themselves. So if you have a humid enough enclosure for them, if you have the female laying like in a little humid nest box, if you want, you can actually leave her with the eggs, especially if she's in fairly good health and condition. If you're breeding, make sure to bump up the female's feeding just a little bit and add some calcium supplements and things like that to her diet. But if she's in good condition after laying eggs, you can let her try and brood the eggs and record that behavior. They'll actually curl around the eggs and protect them until they hatch. So, relatively small, quiet animals. Some of them are docile, some of them are not so smart and extremely food-oriented like these ones are. And some of them can be a little nippy. So you might find an individual for just about any sort of care level that you might have. If you want a really easy beginner, maybe you can find a real docile animal. If you want a little more of a challenge, perhaps you might end up with one that is a little snappier or a little more prissy in their attitude. But certainly a great animal to look into for a relatively small, fairly easy to care for animal, and something a little less common. But that's about all that I have for these guys at the moment. If there's anything that I missed, if there's anything that you have questions about, you can always certainly leave a comment, leave a question below the video, and I will try to get back to you. If you enjoy educational videos like these, certainly consider joining as a patron at patreon.com/hcarlton. Members there get early access to the videos that I release. There's exclusive merchandise. If you're into like the plants that you see behind me, I do monthly seed contests for the members there as well. Hi. And higher tier members will also get extra discounts to the store at carltoncarnivores.com. If you can't do a monthly thing, we do take donations through coffee.com. There's also a Teespring merchandise shop that you can shop at. Or if you can't support monetarily, then simply giving attention to the channel here really helps. Watching the videos all the way through, giving a like, subscribing, leaving a comment, all of that really helps build up the channel here, and in turn helps support me and the business. as we move forward, we're getting close to actually being able to monetize, and so making the videos I can actually fund just for doing these themselves, and you can see more of these. Or if you're just looking for more information on these guys and other things, you can always check out, we have the database and blog on the website at carltoncarnivores.com, where there's more information on the plants, on the animals that we work with. And if you want to see more photos, little video tidbits, and so on, you can always find me on social media, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Carlton Carnivores. But until next time, this is Namer, the spotted python. I'm Hawken Carlton, and this is Carlton Carnivores.